Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special concurrent session, and thank you for joining us. I am Robert Didham, UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Lifestyles at Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences. On behalf of myself and the other presenters in this session, we would like to thank UNESCO, APCEIU, and the government of the Republic of Korea for hosting this important forum and for the opportunity to present our research at this event. I will start by introducing a scoping study conducted in collaboration with partners from 5 countries to complete a mapping of education for sustainability in the Nordic countries. This research was prepared to support the Nordic Council of Ministers in their efforts to strengthen regional collaboration on sustainable development and education for sustainable development. My colleague Charles Hopkins and his research team will then present the second project in this session, key findings from the #IndigenousCSD research that Charles started in 2017 with partners in more than 50 countries. Charles holds the UNESCO Chair in Reorientating Education Towards Sustainability at York University in Canada. He has long been engaged with ESD, first with a focus on teacher education, but has enhanced his scope and also engages with higher education and ESD in communities, especially with Indigenous groups. In relation to this project, we will also examine 2 very interesting case studies presented by partners in this project. Following these presentations, Charles and I will briefly identify some of the key lessons and recommendations that can be taken from these 2 research projects. Without further ado, let me begin with my presentation. May I have my slides, please? As mentioned, I will present today the Mapping Education for Sustainability in the Nordic Countries, or MESN project. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The MESN project was initiated in 2019 by Iceland during its presidency period of the Nordic Council of Ministers, under the overall direction titled A Common Path. The Icelandic Ministry of Education, Science and Culture appointed Olafur Paul Jonsson at the University of Iceland as the leader of the work. And Olafur identified a team of researchers across 5 countries to participate in this scoping study for the Nordic Council of Ministers. The project aimed to map the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal Target 4.7 in compulsory education in Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. The main objective was to provide an overview of how well each of the Nordic countries had integrated the SDGs into both their educational policies and practices. Next slide, please. A team of 14 researchers led by Olafur participated in this project. We also made a special effort in this research to directly involve master's and doctoral students, as well as postgrad researchers in these efforts. Next slide, please. In order to have a clear understanding of what we would focus on in this study, we had to first unpackage SDG 4.7, and through this we identified the following key aspects: education for sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, sustainable lifestyles, appreciation of cultural diversity, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, and appreciation of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Next slide, please. As part of this research, we examined several different aspects to understand how ESD and the aspects of Target 4.7 were addressed in educational policy and practice. The methods included: 1, an analysis of current educational policies in each country to identify how sustainability education is included. 2, an examination of how sustainability is dealt with in teacher education. 3, an evaluation of key characteristics and features of education for sustainable development. And 4, a comparison of similarities and differences between the Nordic countries. Next slide, please. For the policy analysis, we focused on primary and lower secondary education levels, where there are large similarities in the policy framing for these education levels between the 5 countries. We conducted an extensive document analysis reviewing the Education Acts, national curricula, relevant government white papers, and strategy documents from each country. Through the policy analysis, we found that while sustainability does not appear in the national education acts of any of these countries, it is, however, strongly present in the national curricula, special reports, and strategy papers. In Sweden, Education for Sustainable Development has received significant attention within educational policy for over the past 15 years, and sustainable development is directly linked in the descriptions of several different subjects and topics. In national curriculums in Iceland, Finland, and Norway, sustainability has more recently been given a core position and now strongly features as an overarching element in these curriculums. In Denmark, sustainability is referenced in the curriculum many times, but this is done without a common definition provided for how sustainable development should be understood and treated. Thus, its use seems to change depending on which subject it is linked to. Next slide, please. While we recognize that a lack of competency for teachers in handling complex sustainability issues and questions continues to hinder the implementation of ESD, we were only able to scratch the surface with the review of teacher education because it required a more granular examination of the practices at individual teacher education institutions in each country. In teacher education, the situation is even more diverse. There has been a recent trend in several of the Nordic countries to lift mandatory teacher training to a 5-year program and a Master's of Education as the basic teacher qualification. In those teacher education programs that we did review, we found some elements of ESD integrated into the studies, but we also noted that this is often more due to the work of motivated individuals rather than to established mandates or requirements. The identified competency development for teachers in these countries does align with what is noted as key sustainability competencies, but there generally are not explicit links made between ESD in relation to these specific teacher competencies. Furthermore, we found that there remains a level of misalignment between the strong subject-based focus in teacher education and the increasing call for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary teaching approaches for ESD in compulsory education. Next slide, please. During the evaluation of key characteristics and features of ESD, we first looked at the thematic coverage of sustainable development within the curriculum and in teaching practice. Here we see that a focus on knowledge contents about sustainable development remains the most common feature. But we also found that with some differences between countries, there are efforts to also include a focus on sustainability competencies, skills, values, and attitudes within teaching. Somewhat surprisingly, there was very little clear integration of teaching on the SDGs specifically among these countries. Next slide, please. In addition, we looked at the approaches for integrating ESD into the curriculum. Here we found increasing efforts across these 5 countries to utilize interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary teaching approaches when integrating ESD. And this is directly coupled with a continued effort to integrate sustainability themes directly into traditional subjects. While whole school approaches are only strongly applied in Finland in relation to ESD, we did note that clear commitment to a decentralized curriculum and teaching adapted to local context and linked to real-world issues was a key strength of ESD integration in the Nordic countries. Next slide. Finally, in examining the learning methods and pedagogical approaches used for teaching ESD, we found the most consistent element to be a focus on citizenship education, social responsibilities, and education's role in social learning. While student-centered and active learning are central pedagogical approaches throughout the Nordic countries, they were not always explicitly linked to sustainability education. However, for the majority of countries, there is a direct link made between sustainability education and learning approaches that encourage real-world action and promote changes in behavior. Next slide, please. In summary, the Mezen project found that compulsory education in the Nordic countries shares some striking similarities, reflecting a strong emphasis on certain aspects of sustainability, such as equality, democracy, and environmental education. It was difficult to respond to the question of if there was a common Nordic approach to sustainability education, even though there are some common elements. Much in practice, both between and within the countries, can be varied and highly diverse. One point, though, that we find quite interesting was a common understanding across the Nordic countries of a dual purpose for education in terms of both individual learning and for social forming. Educational policies in these countries highlight the concept of Bildung, or a complex understanding of education in relation to moral development. This, we found, had an interesting ability to alleviate some of the tensions often experienced in ESD between a subjective and humanistic understanding of sustainability education on one hand, and a natural science grounded in objective understanding of sustainability on the other. This concludes the presentation of the Mezen project. I would now like to pass to Charles and his colleagues for their presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Robert. And we could have the first slide, please. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So thanks, for, Robert. This next global research project, hashtag IndigenousCSD, that it's still underway, and it aims to improve the lives of Indigenous youth in or from traditional communities by enhancing the quality of their education. Next slide, please. Building on our prior UNESCO chair-led research in 18 mainly high-scoring PISA countries, showing that ESD further enhanced academic outcomes in already well-performing schools, this research is questioning if ESD, that is, using local social, economic, and environmental issues and designing the appropriate pedagogical approaches, can also enhance the education of those who are amongst the least well-served by education systems, that is, the world's Indigenous youth. The research is designed to serve the SDGs, in particular SDG 4, but it's also aligned with SDGs 8, 11, and 16. And now I'm handing it over to Katrin Kohl, who is our research coordinator, to give the details. Katrin?
Thank you very much, Charles. And we have 5 continents represented already in our participants. Our research was developed in a collaborative approach over the course of a year with all stakeholders involved. 3 global initiatives emerged to be conducted by partnering universities with their Indigenous communities. First, we asked the simple questions: what are the outcomes of a quality education for you? Students, parents, teachers, Indigenous elders, local authorities, and ministry representatives provided us with their answers in 54 settings in 26 countries. The second initiative focused on practice examples, using ESD to deliver a quality education for Indigenous youth. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, we collected 32 examples from 21 countries. Next year, we will perform action research as a third initiative. So what did we learn from asking a simple question on quality education? Most of all, we learned that for all stakeholders, the hopes for educating Indigenous students overlap with those for mainstream education. It was important that Indigenous children, like other students, would be exposed to locally relevant themes and develop the knowledge and skills to thrive in an uncertain world today and in the future, and be aware and be proud of who they are. Next slide, please. The key findings from this research were summarized in 10 policy recommendations aligned with UNESCO's policy on engaging with Indigenous peoples. To highlight only 4, 21st century competencies, including Indigenous elders and the local community in the learning process, and engaging within international networks were highlighted as quests from all regions. The second initiative, examples of good practice, was used to inform a report on, to the Special Rapporteur for Indigenous Rights to the UN Human Rights Council this year to support the COVID-19 global recovery for Indigenous peoples. The Human Rights Council referred to several of our findings to justify putting education as an important field of action to secure Indigenous peoples' well-being in a post-pandemic world. More details can be found in the research reports. I will share the link. Now I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues who will present much more concrete examples. First one is Pigga Keskitalo, a North Sami-speaking scholar. She's a senior researcher at the University of Lapland in Finland. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Helsinki and has 20 years of experience in pre-service teacher training from the Sami University of Applied Science in Norway. Pigga Keskitalo comes from the Otsioki Sami community and lives with her family in the Paltuoma village in eastern Nordic. And Sheila will follow Pigga, working as an education advisor in schools with the largest number of Indigenous Orangasli. Sheila Santharamohana has served in several roles at LEAP-ED services in Malaysia, in program monitoring, evaluation, curriculum design, and now on-site school improvement. She has 25 years of teaching experience spanning university, adult learning, secondary schools, and now facilitates upskilling for teachers and school leadership. So I'm handing it over to you, Pigga. The floor is yours.
Hello everyone and greetings from the Sami land, and I'm living in Finland, Finnish side of Sami. And today I'm going to present these two case studies that I have been involved with the research project. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sami people are living in 4 countries in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and called the Kola Peninsula in Russia. And currently we have got 9 Sami languages left, which are variously endangered according to UNESCO criteria. And there are for about 100,000, between 150,000 Sami people living in these vast, diverse areas. And what is the very challenging context at the moment is that, for example, in Finland at the moment, 75% of the Sami children live in outside the Sami core areas without the act-based, proper act-based support. Next slide, please. In our case studies, we looked to issues. We wanted to see how is this contact teaching outside the core Sami area happening at the moment in the very demanding contexts, and then the other case is vocational education in Sami homeland. And at the moment, in different countries, the Sami education is conducted in a bit different ways. For example, Norway has got a separate Sami school system and Sami curriculum system, while in Finland there is no such a system, but Sami education is happening in a municipality school side by side with Finnish-speaking teaching in Sami core areas, which is happening in Utsjoki, Inari, Sodankylä, and Inari municipalities. Next slide, please. We conducted in a research group this first case study, education outside the Sami core areas, interviewing parents, pupils, stakeholders, and school leaders and educational leaders. And what they expressed in those interviews are that there are many challenges and also lots of possibilities and potential, but many issues that should be further developed. So first, which is very familiar for Indigenous and minority teaching, is that there is lack of qualified teachers, despite the fact that at the moment there are many places, for example, University of Oulu, University of Lapland in Finland, Sami University of Applied Sciences in Norway, and Tromsø and Noor University and Umeå University in Sweden that are educating Sami-speaking teachers. Another issue is that indigenous peoples worldwide, globally, they share the history of assimilation policies. So this has produced side by side the thing that there is also, because of the minority situation, it has produced this kind of diversity of learners, which mean that at the same teaching situation, there can be different learners with different competencies in their mother tongue. And also outside the Sami core areas, the teaching is happening as an extracurricular activity, which means that pupils will learn Sami language 2 hours per week, but there are only 120 pupils attending at the moment for about less than 200 and 1,800 pupils in Finland. They are not attending to the teaching, which means that this is making very threatened situation to Sami language future. And also one issue is that teaching providers' attitudes vary a lot. But what was really positive is that learners' motivation instead is quite high, and they report also very high connection to the culture and language. And there is one good project going on at the moment, Sami Distance Education Project, as an activity to support these learners. Next slide, please. And there should be, of course, then developed this kind of act-based support and funding-based support so that the teaching situation will be proceeding better in future. And we have also started to develop maybe more culturally meaningful practices for teaching in outside the Sami core areas, and I'm working at the moment in ADVOST research project funded by the Academy of Finland. Next slide, please. Another project was this vocational education in Sami homeland area, and this was connected to another project, Arctic Pedagogy 2 project, which was funded by the European Social Fund. So we were invited together with one colleague from the University of Lapland to develop this herding study program, and this was connected then to this UNESCO study program. So it is already ESD bound study program, but what was really peculiar in this study program is that many of those students are learning at homes in their reindeer herding homes many weeks, because this is organized, this study, so that they can do that in that way. So we came there then to develop this digital education so that it's easier for the students to learn while they are off campus. And also we conducted then with students this kind of societal project. They took photographs while they were studying, and then we were presenting their study program at the University of Lapland and then in the Sami Education Center in Inari. Next slide, please. You can contact me then, Pigga Keskitalo, pigga.keskitalo@ylapland.fi. There is I missing from my email. Kihtu Oulu, aina lämai.
And over to you, Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrin. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to pose a question to the audience. What is the most impactful area within school communities to improve marginalized and Indigenous communities? This Slido will be open for your response throughout this presentation. Thank you. One of the quotes which made a deep impression on me during this research was from a teacher. She said, "In all that we do for our Orang Asli students, we have to be sincere and earnest. And they will receive us openly with the same and more." So Selamat Sejahtera and good morning, delegates all over the world. My topic today has very much to do with the heart underpinning the hard work. In fact, the unlearning and relearning of values which lay the basis for skills sharing in empowered and empowering school leadership. For this research, the focus was on how school leadership built engagement towards community, school inclusiveness, and collaboration. Next slide, please. And next. Although Malaysia has the Orang Asal in East Malaysia and the Orang Asli in West Malaysia, they are very different. The Orang Asli or original or first peoples are a minority in the peninsula, while the Orang Asal in East Malaysia are the majority. There are 18 very different groups of Orang Asli, very distinct, with different languages, ways of living and thinking. The Senoi, comprising 55%, make up the largest communities, while the Semang or Negrito, the poorest, at 3%, are the oldest and smallest group. The Proto-Malays comprise the other 42% and are more diverse. Nevertheless, Orang Asli from cradle to grave are under the purview of the Department of Orang Asli Development. The Aboriginal Peoples Act 1954 protects the Orang Asli's right to education and support services. Next slide. Orang Asli history still affects the psychosocial conditions in education. Most Malaysians do not know about Orang Asli history, their contributions to modern Malaysia, their heritage, and their lived experience. This contributes to discriminatory attitudes. Likewise, the Orang Asli distrust of outsiders limit their interaction with other Malaysians. Again, this is not helped by recent events concerning health and the ongoing land rights issues dominating Orang Asli discourse and the media. Next slide, please. Despite these challenges, we expect the Orang Asli population to decrease, but the reverse is true. The Orang Asli population is increasing annually by 2.3%. Figure 1 illustrates the changing demographic, with more Orang Asli venturing into cities and towns for work, further studies, and marriage with Orang Asli and non-Orang Asli. With the population increase and development of ancestral land, the Orang Asli and government are now looking to education for answers and solutions. Currently, 1 in 100 Orang Asli children obtain a high school certificate. The attrition rate is high, and very few Orang Asli in the schooling system complete high school. And we are only talking about the Orang Asli within the schooling system. There are many more. The reasons for these statistics are much researched and includes issues, school leadership, the school environment, and the teaching and learning process itself. Next slide, please. To raise outcomes for the Orang Asli children, the key objective for this research is to identify practices that foster engagement and learning. What attributes in school programs increase engagement, and how do schools drive change from within to improve the outcomes for Orang Asli students? How do the beliefs and attitudes of school leaders and teachers influence the effectiveness of school initiatives? The 3 schools chosen had populations of different Orang Asli ethnicities. 2 primary schools exclusively Orang Asli, and 1 secondary school where Orang Asli were the minority. They were all part of the Trust School program. Just some background. The Trust School program is a public-private partnership and is described by the World Bank Report on High-Performing Education 2013 as an innovation in which a private sector partner is entrusted with management of publicly financed schools and held responsible for school outcomes. Our role at LIPAD has been to design, develop, and deliver the Trust School program in the 94 public schools throughout the country. We conducted focus group and one-to-one interviews with the school leadership teams, teachers, parents, and community leaders, community teacher mentor educators, and students. Also interviewed were external agencies and individuals, as well as site visits to 5 schools, including another Orang Asli school and 2 villages. Next slide. The tool used by school teams to self-evaluate was the Trust School Standards and Practices document, which outlines the 4 strategic goals for school improvement. An evidence-based approach was used to measure school performance in improving student outcomes through the 4 strategic goals: quality leadership, quality teaching and learning, student potential, and parent-community partnerships. However, central to this, multiculturalism and culturally responsive school leadership and practices evolved from the 4 strategic goals, namely leadership through collaborative partnerships, capacity building, and inclusiveness. The next 2 slides are examples of practices pre-COVID, which the schools implemented to develop participatory leadership in the parent community. In the next slide please. So these are some of the initiatives. These are some examples of the Warm Defenders community parenting in building social bridging and culture capital through relevant curriculum and hands-on learning. Next slide, please. The results of the programs were improved attendance, higher school enrollment, and decreased attrition rates. Also, upskilling parents empowered parental groups to proactively undertake community projects, then contributing to mutual school community goals. Some gaps still exist. We should review achievement seen through the eyes of examinations and embrace a humanistic approach, school-based assessment, Orang Asli relevant and responsive curriculum, personhood building, advocacy and career skills, and the new literacies of sustainable and ethical entrepreneurship, finance, digital, and civil. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. The pandemic has highlighted many long-standing challenges: access to communities, access to the curriculum, low literacy and numeracy, redirection of government and agency priorities and funds, and lowered expectations for Orang Asli children. However, the learning loss in start of school have also afforded opportunities such as closer school and home communication, improvement in school transition programs, focus on social emotional learning, well-being, mental health, and positive school environments. Schools are also working harder to form networks with communities and agencies. Next slide, please. One school leader said he is driven from the heart first and then the head. And when there is an agreed plan, you share the work. Differences there will always be, but school leadership that can look beyond them will see these as strength. From the case studies of the 3 schools, a culturally responsive and competent school leadership empowers communities through enculturing, not acculturation. Through service leadership and capital building, school leadership can support Orang Asli engagement within and beyond. Through dialogue, knowledge sharing, and enabling diverse ways of learning, they meet community needs. It fosters a shared purpose and vision, and learning from communities, it can change beliefs, can promote equity, and it can empower communities. So some recommendations, we need to look at alternative curriculum and assessment to meet the needs of Indigenous peoples in school, life, and career pathways. A focus on transferable skills, new literacies, and capital building is integral. Upskilling Orang Asli youth, mentors, teachers, and mothers through community schools by engaging communities and ensuring support is efficient and available, decentralizes education and puts needs first. Lastly, advocacy continues for better education, life choices, and outcomes through improved processes and laws. Post-pandemic, a review of such policies may become more urgent as the impact on the economic, social, and health of the Orang Asli are still being ascertained. Thank you for your responses for the questions posed, the question posed earlier. Your collective insight would be beneficial in helping shape programs for the Orang Asli Malaysia. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Thank you, Pigga and Sheila, for the very interesting cases and projects examples. Charles and I will now briefly try to summarize some of the key findings from these two very different research projects that we've presented. We must begin by recognizing the importance that policy plays in providing mandates for ESD and ensuring the necessary structures and resources for its implementation. Policy is also important from a research perspective as it can be easily tracked and documented. However, we must also acknowledge that only looking at policy is ineffective in telling us about what is actually being taught and how it is being implemented. To better understand this, we must look deeper at how ESD is actually integrated into the curriculum and actualized in teaching practice. We do find that the inclusion of policy for a decentralized curriculum is one effective measure that ensures ESD is locally contextualized and taught in relevance to dealing with real-world issues. We also see that a focus towards citizenship and participation is a valuable way to create active engagement and experience in sustainability transformations as part of a student-centered process of learning and competency development in ESD. I pause to take a question from Ashley Emerton that was asked, how do you navigate between balancing culturally and contextually embedded learning with the need for broad global learning? And here explain that we see that in traditional awareness raising about sustainable development, there's often an effort to start from the global perspective to contextualize the scientific issues, the challenges globally, then step down to national responsibility, then maybe local level responsibility, and finally personal level responsibility. In education for sustainable development, we see that there's a really powerful possibility to flip this and start with the personal responsibility and make personal connections where people really have much more of an emotional link to issues of sustainability, and then move out to working at a local level to be active and engaged. And then from this, build up that knowledge and recognition to how sustainability, the local sustainability and personal sustainabilities link to the wider context of sustainability at a global level. So I think these both can be coupled very well, but the engagement is an important process of this. This leads us to note the importance that learning methods and pedagogical approaches play in realizing the transformative nature of ESD. Here we highlight the importance of learning that is both authentic and relevant, and learning approaches that engage students from the perspectives of heart, hands, and head to be active and critically reflective in working together towards a sustainable future. This also raises a key concern for ESD, which is the recognition that many of the key competencies that we are working to achieve, for example, critical thinking, systems thinking, and emotional capacities, can be difficult to effectively measure, and this challenges us to better consider how to track and make these intangible features more tangible. Here, we must suggest that learning as a whole, and ESD specifically, is a lifelong journey, not a destination, and it is the journey that we must keep in focus, and where we can actually conduct useful measurement. Charles will now elaborate further on these points.
Thank you very much, Robert. You know, it's true, as UNESCO chairs, both Robert and I are encouraged to bring forward policy recommendations with our research to guide those who are responsible for sort of addressing the situation that we find or that we've investigated. This is made clear by Katrin a little bit earlier when she talked about how we took our policy recommendations and shared them with the Human Rights Council and where they were embedded. I think although our two research projects are different, we did find similarities in sort of global policy recommendations. For instance, one of the things that we've all found is to be sure and include the stakeholders throughout the entire process in designing the research, carrying it out, and reporting back and sharing what we found afterwards. Another one that we found when working with the Indigenous, surely we need to distinguish very carefully between the word equitable and equal. We also asked to all look at measurements and numbers and so on when we're reporting. There are so many difficulties in assessment, such as when we start to educate the whole child, then aspects that are so important to both ESD and global citizenship education, such as values, ethics, and perspectives, and so on. These are largely intangible, and we don't know when they will emerge in a real life situation. So one of the things I'd like to recommend is that perhaps we start measuring and reporting on the input rather than trying to assess the output. Right? Let's talk about the kinds of things, of interventions that we do. How do we try and make things transformative and so on? So I'll stop there as our time is running down, and perhaps if we could have Sheila's results from this LEGO, that would be nice. Or Robert, back over to you.
Yes, I think we'll just bring up the results from the Slido as we say goodbye to you and close the session. And you can see the results here. And on behalf of all the presenters, Charles, Katrin, Pigga, Sheila, and myself, we thank you for joining us today and hope that this session inspired you towards our collective efforts to realize education as a global common good and its role in supporting sustainability transformations. Once again, we would like to also show our appreciation to UNESCO, APCEIU, and the government of the Republic of Korea for convening and hosting this valuable forum. Thank you and good day.